Okay, so picture this. You're sitting somewhere right now, maybe at your desk, maybe in your car, and there's a decent chance you've got a piece of gum in your mouth or a pack sitting in your bag somewhere close by. It's probably the most boring object you own. Nobody thinks twice about chewing gum. It's just there, a stick of mint-flavored nothing that you chew for a few minutes and toss out. But here's the thing. The actual history of chewing gum is one of the weirdest, most tangled stories in American history. And it starts with a Mexican general who lost his leg in a cannon explosion, got exiled to Staten Island, and accidentally invented one of the biggest industries in the world by trying to make cheap rubber. I'm not kidding, that's genuinely how modern chewing gum got its start. So today, we're covering the full history of chewing gum, from ancient tree resin all the way to the failed rubber experiment that changed everything. And trust me, by the end of this, you're never gonna look at that little stick of gum in your pocket the same way again. But to understand how insane this story gets, we gotta go back way further than the 1800s. We gotta go back thousands of years, because humans chewing on stuff that isn't food is actually one of the oldest habits we have as a species. Archaeologists have found lumps of birch bark tar in Scandinavia that are over 9,000 years old, complete with actual human teeth marks still pressed into them. 9,000 years. That's older than most civilizations we talk about. The ancient Greeks were doing something similar too, chewing on a resin called mastic, which comes from the mastic tree, mainly grown on this one island in Greece called Chios. They chewed it to clean their teeth and freshen their breath, which, honestly, not that different from why we chew gum today. Meanwhile, over in what's now Mexico and Central America, the Mayans were chewing something called chicle, which is this milky white sap that comes from the sapodilla tree. They called it chicle, and it was a totally normal part of daily life, kind of how we just casually pop a piece of gum in our mouth without thinking about it. And here's a detail that gets left out of basically every version of this story. In Mayan culture, chewing chicle in public as an adult was actually seen as kind of inappropriate. It was considered something you did in private, or you did if you were let's just say, a woman working a certain profession. Adults chewing gum openly in public was looked down on, which is wild when you think about how differently we treat it now, where you can chew gum in a business meeting and nobody blinks. Now, fast forward a bunch of centuries, and early Native American tribes in New England were doing their own version of this with spruce tree resin, chewing on hardened sap from spruce trees for the same basic reasons. Fresh breath, something to do with your hands, a little bit of flavor. And here's where it gets interesting, because early European settlers in America actually picked up this habit directly from Native Americans. By the early 1800s, a guy named John B. Curtis and his father started collecting spruce resin, boiling it down, cutting it into strips, and selling it as State of Maine pure spruce gum. This was, as far as we know, the first commercially sold chewing gum in the United States. It wasn't exactly popular yet, and it definitely didn't taste great. Spruce resin has this bitter, kind of medicinal taste to it, but it planted a seed. People were now used to the idea that you could buy gum in a store instead of just chewing on random tree sap you found yourself. Around the same time, another product started popping up called paraffin wax gum, which was exactly what it sounds like, chewing on flavored candle wax. Sounds disgusting, right? But at the time, it was actually one of the more popular gum products in America because it held its flavor a little longer than spruce gum did. So by the mid-1800s, you've got this small but growing market of Americans who are into the idea of chewing something just for the sake of chewing it. But none of this stuff was quite right yet. None of it had that perfect chew, that perfect stretch, that thing we associate with real chewing gum today. And that's where our story takes this absolutely bizarre turn, because the missing ingredient, the one that was going to change everything, was about to arrive in New York City in the pocket of all people, a Mexican defeated general.
That general's name was Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, and if that name sounds familiar, it's because he's the same guy connected to the Texas Revolution and the events at the Alamo back in 1836. By the 1860s, Santa Anna's political career back in Mexico had completely fallen apart, and he found himself living in exile on Staten Island, New York, of all places. Here's the thing about Santa Anna, though. He wasn't just some broke, forgotten ex-leader hiding out. He still had this one idea he was convinced could make him rich again and fund his return to power in Mexico. And that idea was chicle. Remember chicle, that same sap the Mayans had been chewing for thousands of years? Well, Santa Anna knew that chicle grew abundantly back home, and he had this theory that chicle could be turned into a cheap substitute for rubber. And rubber, at that point in history, was an incredibly valuable material. It was used for tires, for boots, for waterproofing, for basically an entire industrial revolution's worth of products. And natural rubber from South America was expensive and hard to get reliably. So Santa Anna brought a huge chunk of raw chicle with him to New York, hoping to find someone who could help him experiment with it. And that's where he crossed paths with a photographer and inventor named Thomas Adams. Adams wasn't some big-shot scientist. He was actually kind of struggling financially at the time, tinkering with inventions on the side to make ends meet. Santa Anna approached him with this pitch. Take this chicle, figure out how to vulcanize it like rubber, and we'll both get rich. So Adams got to work. He set up a workshop in the back of his house in Staten Island and spent months, literally months, trying every method he could think of to turn this chicle into usable rubber. He tried mixing it with sulfur. He tried boiling it at different temperatures. He tried combining it with other materials to strengthen it. And every single time, it failed. It just wouldn't behave like rubber. It would either stay too soft and sticky, or it would crack and fall apart. At one point, Adams even tried to make rubber overshoes out of it, and the whole batch just melted into a gooey mess. After about a year of failed experiments, Adams was sitting there with literally tons, and I mean that almost literally, tons of useless chicle just sitting in his workshop. And Santa Anna had already given up and gone back to Mexico, still broke, still without his rubber empire. So, Adams is sitting there staring at this massive pile of failed material, and here's the moment that changes everything. He remembers something. He remembers seeing a young girl in a drugstore buying a piece of paraffin wax gum, the stuff we talked about earlier. And he thinks to himself, chicle already has that soft, chewy texture naturally. Why am I trying to turn it into rubber when it might work perfectly fine as something people already like to chew? So Adams takes a small piece of the raw chicle without any additives, rolls it into little pellets by hand, and takes them down to a local drugstore to sell as a chewing product. No flavor, no sugar coating, just plain chicle. And people bought it. They actually liked it better than the paraffin wax gum because the texture was so much better. It held its chew. It didn't fall apart in your mouth. Adams called it Adams New York No. 1, and it's widely considered the first modern chewing gum made from natural chicle instead of spruce resin or wax. This was around 1871, and Adams quickly realized he was sitting on something much bigger than he originally thought. He started experimenting with flavors, and one of his early hits was a licorice-flavored gum called Blackjack, which stayed on shelves for over 100 years afterward. Adams built an actual gum manufacturing business out of this, the Adams Sons Company, and started producing gum on a much bigger scale, using machines instead of just hand-rolling pellets in his workshop. But Adams wasn't going to be alone in this space for long. Word got around fast that there was serious money in this chewing gum thing, and pretty soon other manufacturers started popping up trying to get a piece of it. And that brings us to probably the single most important name in the entire history of chewing gum as a business, William Wrigley Jr.
Wrigley didn't actually start out selling gum at all. He started his career selling soap and baking powder door to door in Chicago back in the 1890s. And here's the thing about Wrigley that made him different from basically every other businessman at the time. He understood marketing on a level that almost nobody else did back then. His original trick was giving away free baking powder with every order of soap to sweeten the deal. Then he noticed the baking powder was actually more popular than the soap itself, so he switched his whole business to baking powder. And then, to sweeten that deal even further, he started throwing in 2 free packs of chewing gum with every order of baking powder. And you can probably guess what happened next. The gum became more popular than the baking powder. So Wrigley did it again. He pivoted his entire company once more, this time fully into chewing gum, launching brands that are still around today, Juicy Fruit in 1893 and Wrigley's Spearmint shortly after, in 1893 as well. But here's what really set Wrigley apart, and this is the part that gets skipped in most versions of this story.
He was one of the very first businessmen in American history to fully commit to mass advertising as the core strategy of a company, back when most businesses thought advertising was kind of a waste of money. Wrigley spent enormous amounts on print ads, on billboards, and eventually he pulled off one of the boldest marketing moves in American business history. In 1915, he mailed a free stick of gum to every single person listed in every phone book in the entire United States. That's over 1 million households receiving free samples in the mail at a time when that kind of scale of direct marketing had basically never been attempted before. It worked incredibly well, and Wrigley's became a household name almost overnight because of it. Now, here's where the story takes another turn that most people don't know about. Because chewing gum didn't just become an American snack, it actually became a tool of American military strategy. During World War I, and even more so during World War II, chewing gum was included as a standard item in soldiers' ration kits. The idea was that gum helped soldiers stay alert, helped calm their nerves in stressful situations, and helped with something surprisingly practical, keeping their mouths from getting dry in situations where clean water wasn't always available. General Dwight Eisenhower himself reportedly requested that huge quantities of gum be shipped along with other supplies for troops overseas, because morale and stress relief mattered just as much as ammunition and food in his view. And here's the part that's genuinely fascinating. As American soldiers moved through Europe and parts of Asia during the war, they brought chewing gum with them everywhere. And local civilians, especially children, had often never seen or tasted anything like it before. It became this small, almost accidental form of cultural diplomacy. Soldiers would hand out sticks of Wrigley's gum to kids in occupied territories, and in a lot of places, that simple gesture became one of the first friendly interactions between American troops and local populations. Historians actually refer to this phenomenon as a form of soft power, this idea that a 5-cent piece of chewing gum did more to shape a positive image of America abroad in some regions than official military policy did. After the war ended, that global exposure meant chewing gum demand exploded internationally, and companies like Wrigley's expanded aggressively into markets across Europe and Asia throughout the 1950s and 60s. But not every country welcomed it. In fact, one of the strangest chapters in this whole story happened in Singapore, where in 1992, the government implemented a near-total ban on the sale of chewing gum, and this ban is still largely in effect today. The reasoning was actually pretty practical, if a little extreme. Discarded gum was causing serious problems, gumming up door sensors on the country's new subway system, sticking to sidewalks, creating cleanup costs the government considered completely unnecessary for what they saw as a non-essential product. To this day, you technically cannot walk into a regular store in Singapore and buy a pack of gum, unless it's for medical or dental purposes with a prescription. And here's one more thing that might genuinely surprise you. Modern chewing gum, the stuff you're probably chewing right now if you have a piece in your mouth, almost certainly does not contain any actual chicle from the sapodilla tree anymore. Starting around the 1950s and 60s, the natural supply of chicle became harder and less efficient to source at the massive scale gum companies now needed. So companies switched to synthetic gum bases instead, made primarily from petroleum-based polymers, essentially food-grade versions of the same kind of material used in plastics and rubber products. Companies are legally allowed to just list this ingredient as gum base on the packaging without specifying exactly what's in it, because the specific formula is considered a trade secret. So that soft, stretchy texture you're chewing on, that thing that started with Santa Ana's failed rubber experiment almost 150 years ago, in a strange, almost poetic way, chewing gum eventually did become a rubber-like product after all, just not in the way Santa Ana or Thomas Adams ever could have imagined back in that little workshop on Staten Island. So next time you unwrap a piece of gum without even thinking about it and pop it in your mouth on your way out the door, just remember, you're chewing on the leftover legacy of a failed Mexican general's rubber scheme, a broke inventor's lucky accident, and one of the most aggressive marketing campaigns in American business history, all rolled into a tiny, forgettable little stick.